Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology for the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs. Ranger trials as one will call, no we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. Today we're jumping into the hotbed of creationism, and we're going to start with Noah's Ark and the Great Global Flood. We're going to discuss if there is any evidence proving a global flood, and then we're going to look at the possibility of Noah's Ark existing today. Thanks for listening, and get ready to think critically.
Are a staple of archaeology. We don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Today we are discussing creationism. We've got some stuff from Answers in Genesis, some of the little handouts, and we're going to discuss, I would like to, because it's such a big topic, I'd like to stay focused on Noah's Ark and evidence of the flood, because evidence of the Ark is more archaeology than the geology that proves that it did not take.
Right.
Of course, and we had just gotten done discussing the length of a day biblically or whatever.
Right.
But before we get too deep into it, I want to make sure that people understand that we are not trying to bash religion, even though I think my opinions on religion will become quite evident by the end of this. We're not attacking religion itself. We're just attacking the idea of creationism, which is a pseudoscientific attempt at explaining the creation of the world without using science.
Right. Well, usually when we say creationism, it's usually shorthand for the phrase that's used by its proponents, which is scientific creationism. Because these are folks who are not saying, it's one thing for somebody to say, hey, listen, I believe this because I feel it in my heart that it's true. I base this on faith. We've got nothing to say about that. That's a separate issue. Your religion, your faith, that's separate. Yeah. But if you are saying when I speak to folks who have a very deep belief in their religion, firmly believe that what the Bible says is true, that's great. But I say that's fine, and I have nothing to say about that. But if you start telling me here are the facts, here's scientific support for the recent creation of the earth. Here's scientific evidence for a giant worldwide flood. Now you're playing in my ballpark because I'm an archaeologist and we're talking science. And that's what this is about. This is not about atheism or agnosticism or anything else, or telling people don't believe what you believe. It is about, this is what the scientific record shows. And that has very little to do with what most people embrace as their religious belief.
Right. And it's like you said, it's what you want to believe is what you want to believe. But when you step into the ring of science, you're stepping away from belief. And now you're trying to mold facts and evidence around a belief, and that just usually does not work in any way, shape, or form.
Go. I mean, you heard. Are you aware of, familiar with what I think it was Pope John Paul II said about all this, which is that he's talking about evolution. This the leader of the Catholic Church. I mean, you're not going to get somebody much more religious than that. And basically, what he said was, and I'm going to paraphrase, was that the Bible is a book about how to get to heaven. It's not a book about the heavens. In other words, it's a book that tells you how to live a moral, decent life that you will be rewarded in the afterlife. But it's not a book about geology or biology or archaeology. And so don't put it, the Pope said, listen, as long as you leave room in your heart for a creator, for God at the very beginning, who maybe set evolution in motion, he was fine with that. So this is not an attack on religion by any stretch of the imagination. It's about the scientific evidence for claims made by folks who say the world is very recent, the world has not changed terribly much in the 6,000 years, and there was a giant flood.
Right, and I think it's important to point out here that, again, we're not attacking the Bible because, honestly, I've read the Bible. It has nothing to say about this. There's nothing in the Bible that has anything to say about archaeology or anything. I mean, most people will agree that the stories in the Bible are parables and they're not literal events. Answers in Genesis being the one of the people who do say that it is literal. They argue for a literal 6-day creation,
right.
and those 6 days being, I believe, 24-hour periods. They might need to correct me on that one, but and they also believe that there was a literal worldwide flood, and that somewhere out there is a Noah's Ark, or at some point there was a Noah's Ark. But you've covered you've covered Noah's Ark in one of your books, at least.
In my archaeological frauds book, there's a chapter about both old-time religion and New Age philosophies on how folks bring those to the table sometimes when they're talking about human antiquity, the archaeological past, the geological past. And the flood issue is a really interesting one, because at least in that case, there are, as no matter what your perspective is, you have to understand that in science, we look at evidence, we come up with explanations for that evidence, and then we test those explanations out. So if in fact there had been a worldwide flood, if in fact the vast majority of animal life on the planet was wiped out in that flood, if in fact the only people left in the world were Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and the 3 wives of those people. So we're looking at a small handful of people. If that really had happened, we would be able to see that in the archaeological and geological record. It would be abundantly clear. It would be super obvious.
Well, if you talk to a gentleman by the name of Willie Dyer, who touts himself as a 7-time PhD candidate and writes PhD after his name 7 times on his business card.
There you go.
There is geological evidence that all of the continents on the planet have been underwater. And when I confronted him about this at the Creationist Expo, I was like, well, you are correct. There is evidence that every continent on the planet has been underwater at some point. There is no evidence that all of them were underwater at the same time.
And that it was only 5,000 years ago.
Right. And then it was certainly not 6,000 years ago that they were all doing this. But, he had it was a very interesting thing to go to, because he also made the claim that all of the great cultures of the world existed on one continent, which was Pangaea. Now, Pangaea being a real thing, but he was not using it in its actual context. But he was making the claim that all of the great civilizations, all of Egypt, all of China, the civilizations that rose out of Africa, and also the Native American cultures that were probably thriving at that time. I don't have my timeline straight. But he said they all existed on this mega continent, and then and they all spoke the same language because of the Tower of Babel hadn't fallen yet.
There you go.
And that the destruction of the Tower of Babel was this cataclysmic event that made all of the continents separate. So not only was the tower itself, not only did God destroy the tower and scramble all the languages, but he literally tore a continent apart so that people would never work together again to try to build a tower up to the sky, which is why we build skyscrapers today. But I just found that to be a very interesting way of mixing stories together in order to make pieces fit.
Right. I mean, and the thing is, that's great. That's a really interesting hypothesis. And now as scientists, we say, all right, if that was the case, if that really had happened, what would we expect to see in the archaeological and historical records of these many different civilizations? And what's interesting is, well, if they all were on the same continent, then we might expect that their agriculture would involve the same crops, because after all, same continent, same flora, same fauna. And we would expect if they all evolved on the same continent that they would have affected one another. They would have impacted one another in terms of their building styles, their artifact styles, their metallurgy, so that we would expect, therefore, that the Egyptian civilization, Mesopotamian, the Indus Valley civilization, the Shang of China, and the Maya, and the Teotihuacan, and the Toltecs, and the Inca would all have very, very close correlations in terms of their maybe not their language, if that was before the Tower of Babel, but their metallurgy, their ceramics, their art styles, and so on and so forth. And I think that any objective observer would say, that ain't so, that these cultures are enormously diverse and in fact very different in any one of a number of ways. And so a better explanation would be that these guys developed independently in separate parts of the world. And that's easily enough tested. And I think that the test of the hypothesis that all these guys were on one continent together not that long ago simply falls down when we look at the data.
Right, exactly. Well, and the other, like you said, when you look at the data, you don't see those things. And to back up what you were saying, though, we do, using like the dinosaurs, I know that they can trace where the dinosaurs were based on pre-continental drift, because you will find certain types of dinosaurs on two different modern continents, and they can trace them back together, right. and we know they fit back together, and it's like, oh, okay, well, we've got this type of dinosaur here, and we've got that same type of dinosaur in Australia or something, and obviously it's because they were once part of the same continent. But there were I think there's 7 different continental phases before we get to the modern positions of the continents. And there's ample evidence that the continents are still drifting.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But this is not archaeology. I'm sorry.
We're getting into geology. But it's a valid point that we are not, as scientists, it's not our job to immediately discount a hypothesis and say that can't possibly be true. Well, as scientists, we hear a hypothesis and we say, okay, how do we test that out? What do we predict the data must look like in order to support that hypothesis? And the hypothesis that all of the great civilizations were all on one continent fairly recently absolutely has no support in the archaeological record. Period. Right. And that's it. Well, let's move on to the next hypothesis. Your friend needs to move on because there simply isn't any evidence to support that claim.
Exactly. So let's look at Noah's Ark and the flood. Like I said, you're familiar with this because you wrote about it in one of your books, and I'm familiar with it because it's a topic that I bring up when I lecture at Gen Con, just because it's something everybody can relate to. I mean, almost everyone has heard the Noah's Ark story and the flood story.
Absolutely. And you know what's really funny is that there were people who heard about the flood story long before the Bible was written, because the biblical story of the flood is actually based on a much older Mesopotamian story where there's a guy, his name is Utnapishtim, he's not Noah, but so many of the details of that story were just picked up by the folks who became the early Jews, picked that story up. In the Middle East, it was a story floating around. That's a bad choice of words, but whatever. And they just incorporated it into their creation story.
Well, the measurements for the Ark in both stories are identical.
Yep.
We learned about that when I was in freshman year in high school, and I was like, oh, well, that sealed the deal for me. I was like, oh, it's the same story.
And putting the pitch over the wood, and even in one version of the Mesopotamian story, as the floodwaters are subsiding, Utnapishtim sends out, I believe it's a raven or a dove or whatever, and when it comes back with like a stick showing that, well, something is growing, there's dry land, and that shows up in the Bible story as well. So obviously that's a story. Now, by the way, you do not find that story among the Maya. You don't find that story among the Aztecs or the Inca or the mound builders. That is from a particular part of the world, the Middle East. And for people who say, oh, no, missionaries recorded that story elsewhere, well, missionaries actually told that story to native people all over the world, who then in this process of syncretism sort of incorporated what these visitors were telling them into their own stories and their own myths.
Right, and that's one of the things that Mr. Ham brings up in his pamphlet, that a lot of the academics like to teach that the biblical flood was a localized flood. And there is a reason that we teach that, and that's because part of archaeology is an extension of the field of anthropology, and anthropology is the study of the humans. And a large part of that is, and I'm not telling this to you, Ken, because
no, of course,
you don't know.
It's fine.
Right. I'm explaining this to the audience.
Should I be taking notes on this, Sarah?
Right. There'll be a test at the end. But anthropologists study the mythology of the different peoples that they study. And like you said, if you find a coastal culture or a culture that lived along a large body of water, you're probably going to find a flood myth of some sort, because that's just what happened. I mean, the Nile, the Egyptians are famous for this. The Nile, you could set your seasons by it. It was so predictable. But, they have a flood myth based around the Nile.
Right. But
then the more inland you get, where people are not living near large bodies of water, you don't hear flood stories because they don't flood.
Right. And it's interesting, too, is that the Nile floods very predictably.
Yes.
Whereas the Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, it's a double river system, and it's a double whammy. It is the floods there, at least before flood control projects, could be very severe, very unpredictable. There are geological and archaeological evidence of major floods where several feet of alluvial silt were laid down probably in a single season. And
right.
I tell you what, if you were living that back then, thousands of years ago, and you experienced that, it probably seemed like the world was flooded. It probably seemed like it was the entire world. And that's
it was your entire world. I mean, that's all that really needed to happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know what? If you look at, say, the creation stories and myths of the Norse people, there are no floods. Guess what? It's all about ice. It's all about ice. Well, of course, that's where they're from. If you look at traditional people and their stories of creation and destruction, and if they live near volcanically active areas, their stories are about volcanoes. That's not terribly surprising that people incorporate the catastrophic natural events that happen in their region, if they incorporate that into their stories about creation and destruction.
Exactly. No, you hit the nail right on the head. So we've established that the flood was a localized flood and not. And there's evidence for that. Because another thing that we would want to see archaeologically, if there was a major flood like that really did bury the whole world. So going back to Dr. Dyer's explanation of how Pangaea was ripped apart, we have all of the major cultures of the world pre-established on Pangaea, and then the flood occurs. You would see archaeologically, well, first off, you'd see the sediment. And secondly, you would see a huge interruption in culture. You would see these cultures. I mean, because if you follow the story, everybody but Noah was killed.
Right.
So you would see all of these major cultures just come to a screeching halt, and then something new sprouting up afterwards. Right. And we do not see that at all.
It's the simplest way to phrase this is, look, you and I do archaeology in the United States, for example. And when I do archaeology here in Connecticut, stratigraphically, when I dig down, the first stuff I encounter clearly shows the existence of a new group of people, and those new people are Europeans. When I go below that, I find completely different material reflecting the presence of the Native Americans who were here. That disjuncture, that break is abundantly clear in the archaeological record. You don't see that in Egypt. You don't see that in the Yucatan Peninsula. You don't see that in South America or Australia. You see in many places, a continuous stratigraphic column showing those people in place developing over a very long period of time. There's no break where suddenly, oh my God, they all must have died, and now they're being replaced. And by the way, the flood story requires us to believe that the ark landed someplace. The Bible does not say Mount Ararat; it says the mountains of Ararat. And in all the reality is we don't know exactly where that is. The modern Mount Ararat has that name relatively recently. So all these guys traipsing up Mount Ararat to look for the ark, it's like as if I called Mount Shasta here in the United States. I think that's Ararat, and people would traipse up that and say, well, maybe the ark is here. But it requires, at the end of, in the story told in Genesis, the ark lands in the mountains of Ararat, and then Noah his wife, 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives spread out across the face of the planet. The planet is now totally depopulated. There's nobody left. And everything starts again with just those people. That kind of a complete destruction. I mean, imagine the meteor impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. Abundantly clear. Lots of dinosaurs gone, other species come into play. We see that in the geological record. The same kind of thing would be seen in the archaeological record if, in fact, 6,000 years ago, bam, all those cultures, all those civilizations were totally and utterly destroyed. Every single person dead. And now we're going to start all over from scratch. If that happened, an archaeologist couldn't see it, we would be incompetent archaeologists. The fact that we don't see it is because it didn't happen.
We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you are and would like to support the podcast, please take a minute to give us a thumbs up or rate the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leaving a brief comment also helps us engage with our audience, and it's good for the algorithm too. If you want to know more about the topics we're discussing, be sure to head over to our Anchor site and look for the show notes for this episode. Links will be in the description. Thank you again, and let's get back to the show. And it also goes back to what you said earlier about all of the cultures existing on Pangaea. If all of the cultures got wiped out and they were being replaced by these, but there's only 6 viable breeding pairs at this point, which is way too low a number for any species. But that's a totally different topic. If you're seeing every modern culture in the world springing forth from these same 3 people who are at least related by the brothers.
Right, of course.
They've all got the same culture. So you would expect the culture that you will see from now on, you would expect them to be identical or at least to share major characteristics, which you do not see.
And if this all happened 6,000 years ago, that's not a lot of time for a great degree of diversity in these cultures to have developed.
Right.
And here's a question that I've asked folks who believe in the literal truth of the flood story. The flood story that you've always been told is that, Noah builds this huge ark. Now, nautical historians will tell you that the size of the ark, based on the metrics given in the Bible, is way out of line with any other boat built during that time. And there's a question then. Well, did Noah have a whole bunch of contractors and subcontractors helping him build this huge boat? Or do we believe that he and his 3 sons built the largest boat ever seen in the world for its time period? I remember checking this out, and the size of the ark was not built in modern times, a boat that size, until the early 20th century. Well, then how did Noah and his 3 sons manage that? And then, since we got 2 of every kind of animal, or maybe 7 of some kinds, and they all just sort of appear at the ark, how about koala bears and kangaroos? Now, they're in Australia. How did they get to the Middle East to get on board the ark? How did animals separated by thousands of miles of ocean get to Noah's Ark?
And see, now we're getting into that whole kinds argument. And actually, at the Creationist Expo, I think my favorite explanation for that, the redistribution of the animals, was there's a suggestion that there was a volcano explosion right after they all got off, and that the volcano explosion propelled the animals to their new continents. And I'm just like, I can't even. And somehow they survived that.
Parachutes.
I don't know.
Come on, Sarah, parachutes.
I guess. I'm like, not to poke too much fun, but we're talking about God, who is supposed to be all powerful. Why didn't he just pick them up and put them there? He really needed a volcano to propel them there.
Which is really cool, because if that's what somebody says and they believe that, then
that's true.
That's out of our, that's that. If you say, if to every objection we give, you simply respond, it was a miracle, then that's fine, because we can't respond to that, because we don't deal with miracles in science.
That's true. found that to be, I don't know, I find some of the explanations to be humorous at best.
I do like that. I mean, I've heard of manna from heaven, but not kangaroos, bonobos, and giraffes.
Can you imagine? You're just, there weren't any people there, I guess, so there's no one to watch it happen, but you just looking up one day and just marsupials just come falling out of the sky on top of you.
Yes.
Just bounce when they hit the ground.
That's another concept, and it's a concept that we deal with in archaeology all the time, but also in paleontology. It's a concept of biostratigraphy.
Right.
So now, if anybody has been to the Grand Canyon, you notice this, and they talk about this, the rangers talk about this. As you walk down that path into that mile-deep canyon, you are passing through strata, layers, which in the view of scientists, you are going back through sort of like pages that go back millions of years. And in each of those pages, there's an entirely different suite of animals. So in other words, you don't find a layer that has, there's dinosaurs and there's people and there's trilobites. You find layers on the top where you see actual evidence of human activity. But those are way up on the top. And as you go further back, you'll find the bones of extinct mammals that we know died off, we say, around 10 or 12,000 years ago. And as you go further back, you find dinosaurs. And further back, you find trilobites. And this sequence of very primitive animals to modern animals is not violated. If all these animals died at the same time in a tremendous flood, including dinosaurs, including people, including house cats and whales and beavers, we would find all those bones all together in the same layers. We don't find that, and we don't find that anywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world, there is a pretty nice, neat biostratigraphic sequence that geologists rely on, biologists, paleontologists, and archaeologists, all well aware of that. And that layering, that sequence, absolutely does not conform with a hypothesis that says, no, all these animals were alive at the same time, and they all died at the same time.
Right. No, and you're absolutely correct again. It's the reason why we can trust it is because you can go anywhere in the world. You can even go to the seafloor if you want, if you can, and you will still see the same division of time via the ground and the rock and the dirt and all of that.
Absolutely right.
We have this pretty well established. We've had it established for a while. It's the law of stratigraphy. It's called that for a reason. But, okay, so we've covered the localized flood. We've covered what we would need to see in order for a global flood to be true, both archaeologically and geologically. Wow.
And it's also, and then we can get into some really hinky stuff here, because we talk about genetics, and archaeologists deal with DNA. There's a molecular archaeology that's a really important part of the discipline now, and we know from the perspective of biology, genetics, and archaeology that if the entire human race right now, all however many billions of people are on the planet right now, if they all derived from, what is it, 8 people, really 6, the 3 sons, and if the genetic variation we see in the world today would be much, much lower. That the kinds of and what's interesting, though, and here's where it gets kind of hinky, is that you actually have had folks say, each of Noah's sons represent a different race, and we'll put scare quotes around that word race, so that there really is this notion that, Japheth, who was the favorite son, he moved with his wife after the flood to Europe, and all Europeans are descended from Japheth.
Yes.
And Shem, he was kind of the medium son, and Shem and his wife and their kids, they moved east to Asia, and all Asians are descended from Shem. And here's where it gets kind of nasty, and it's, Ham was the bad son. We can talk about that in a little bit of why he was considered the bad one. And that Ham and his wife and their kids moved to Africa, and that all dark-skinned Africans are descendant of Ham. Now, the story in the Bible is that, this is kind of funny, that after the flood, and everybody's sort of getting their bearings together. Noah grows grapes, makes wine, drinks the wine, and gets drunk, and is drunk and naked in his tent. And the three brothers are kind of walking by the tent, and they look inside. They go, "Oh my God, Dad's drunk and naked. What should we do?" And apparently Ham is the guy who says, "We should go in there and cover him up because this is embarrassing."
Right.
Japheth says, no. If we do that, then he will know we have seen him in his shame, and that's a bad thing. And Shem, apparently, he's like the intermediate. He doesn't know. Whatever. I'll do whatever you guys say. And so Ham walks in, covers up Noah with his blanket. Noah wakes up and gets really pissed off, and God curses Ham
for doing a nice thing.
You know what? Don't you think that's the rational? If you see your dad laid out drunk and naked on his cot, don't you think it would be a good idea to cover him up? But you
would think that would be the right thing to do if you saw anybody passed out drunk, it's naked. Cover them up. They might be cold. No you don't want to look at that.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really, really, really awful and racist, is that there are people. This is not the Bible doesn't say this, but there are people who have interpreted the curse of Ham, that Noah and God curse Ham, that's the source or origin of the dark skin of Native Africans.
Right.
Because in the Bible, it does say that Ham is cursed, and I'm paraphrasing, and Ham and the descendants of Ham shall forever be servants unto the sons of Japheth and Shem.
Right.
There are people fairly recently in the history of our country who have said that's the biblical justification for slavery.
There are people in modern times that still argue that
which
point.
Is
and it's
amazing, isn't it?
It is, especially since, coming from a field of archaeology and anthropology, we have a decent grasp on evolution. We all came out of Africa. Africa didn't come out of us.
Yeah. In all likelihood, dark skin is the default condition of our species. And us white folks, we're kind of the tip of the iceberg. We're kind of late. We're the evolutionary afterthought. So we're the odd man out. But obviously in the past, many Europeans saw this as a rationale for why there are different races, and also a rationale for why one of the races in particular could be treated badly because somehow they were seen as defective from this original curse that was laid upon their biblical ancestor. Well, that's kind of awful stuff, and that's inexcusable racist crap.
Yes.
And there's no way around that. Now, again, mind you, you have to interpret the Bible to make it, to justify slavery. The Bible does not say, yeah, it's okay, but people have used the Bible in that way to justify slavery.
I'd like it in a future podcast, maybe after the fallout from this one's over with, go over. I personally view modern concepts of race as being kind of inaccurate, and race being a social construct. Therefore, race doesn't technically exist in my world.
Sure.
I'd like to go over that in a future podcast at some point, just to kind of explain to people how what they're perceiving to be race is not real and is completely made up in their own head. But that's a tough topic. That's, again, another really tough topic to go over. And we'll probably
yeah, absolutely. But it's a really interesting and certainly a valid and significant topic for us to discuss in a modern context, where too many people think that human beings come in nice little categories that can be totally separated, and that absolutely is not the case.
Right. I
mean, that's a genetic fact. That's not something that's even arguable.
Right. But people will argue it with you. But anyway. Back to the Ark. So we've covered the flood. Let's get to the really fun part and talk about all of the various discoveries of the actual Ark itself.
Yeah, well, my very, very, very favorite. Now, understand that there are any one of a number of very well-meaning people who have climbed to the top of Mount Ararat and have seen interesting formations that they have interpreted as being somehow a remnant of the Ark. Now, I'm here to tell you that not a single one of those have ever been verified. Not one has ever been verified. That is aerial photographs that have turned out to be geological features. There are a lot of great stories of people, oh yeah, I saw a boat and I took pictures, but well, the pictures never came out. Or we went up there, but the Russians wouldn't. One of the themes in all this as well is that Sarah, you and I know the Ark is up there, but we're
just keeping it secret.
It's a conspiracy. I've never understood that. Why do you think an archaeologist would keep anything secret if they thought it was a significant discovery it made about antiquity? Why would
Well, I'm beginning to understand that our role in the world is some kind of barrier, some kind of secret keeper for the great Illuminati that rules the world. This has never been explained to me in any great detail, but it's what I've put together from the way people react to me, especially when I've asked that question. I've flat out asked people that question. What do I gain by keeping this a secret? And they're like, you keep us in our ways. You keep us doing what they want us to do. And I'm like, I don't even understand. And I don't think you do either. But there's no benefit to me if the Ark were real. There is no benefit to me to keep that a secret.
Oh, yeah, of course. I remember I was on a program once, and somebody attacked me and said that people like me and Ed Krupp, who's an astronomer, that we're trying to keep, we're part of this conspiracy. And then Ed Krupp and I started writing back and forth about how nobody understands this. We meet in a church basement on alternate Thursdays to plot this conspiracy to keep it all quiet. And
we don't know why we're keeping it quiet, but we are.
I mean, it really is to laugh. That anybody who says that archaeologists are conspiring to keep things quiet, you don't know any archaeologists, because clearly that's from a position of extraordinary ignorance. The deal is here's the deal. If anybody out there is getting angry and saying, no, these guys are lying, we know the truth, it's so easy to shut me up. So easy. Show me some real evidence. And then I will walk away with my tail between my legs and go, oh my gosh, these guys were right. And this goes for Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Nephilim and Atlantis and all this other stuff. It's so easy to shut me up and shut all of us up, us skeptics. Evidence. It's all about evidence.
Some evidence.
What is it? But in Missouri, isn't it the license plate? Isn't the motto of Missouri is we're the show me state? That's what science is. We're the show me science, archaeology. Show me and we'll go along with whatever you say if you can show us the evidence. Unfortunately, you guys don't have the evidence.
I think my favorite Ark conspiracy story so far, and I don't remember if I read this out of your book or from another source, but I guess one of the stories that floats around there is that the Russians actually discovered where the Ark was located some umpteen million years ago or whatever. In order to keep it a secret, they don't explain why they're keeping it a secret, but I guess they're Russia, so we don't really have to give a reason. But in order for the Russians to keep it a secret, they killed everybody who was part of the expedition. And my favorite part of that is, if that were true, how do we even know there was a Russian expedition that found the Ark?
They're all dead.
If they're all dead, who's telling me this story?
You missed a very, very important part. And this is something I've actually seen published. And that is, remember that it's not Russia who has kept this all secret. It was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, those were communists, and those are all atheists. And so
they would have been the Soviets at the time.
But the deal is, so the rationale for keeping the Ark story quiet is because they don't want people believing in God or the flood. So because the church, of course, competes with the communist hegemony for power, and so therefore it is the responsibility and the obligation of good communists to keep the evidence that supports religion away from people. So that was explicitly argued by any one of a number of kind of crazy people.
Wow, yeah. Another one that always kind of interested me that it was even a thing was that there was and this is supposedly a fairly recent one. I think this one occurred in like 2000 and supposedly in 2006, that there was an expedition that was led by National Geographic. They paid for it, and they sent out, and there were named people, none of which you can actually find on the internet. They're not real people, but they had names. But they were supposed to be real archaeologists, and the expedition really did go, and they found Ararat, and they found the boat, and then National Geographic shut it down. And I'm like, why? Trust me, National Geographic is not going to put down the probably millions of dollars it's going to cost to lead and fund and get that expedition done. And then when they find the thing they're looking for, shut everything down. They're just not going to do that.
But that argument is part of a broader, very, very strange worldview that poses that, yes, there's this elite, and you and I are in that elite. National Geographic, the government, we are all part of an elite that's trying to oppress common good church-going people. And so,
well, this wasn't even being made by a churchgoer. This was just one of those. I mean, maybe he was religious, but it was just one of these conspiracy people.
Yes,
because there are people who are not religious who do believe that Noah's Ark exists, or they're not like literal religious people. If you know what, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
I'm finding it hard to believe that anybody can separate out that kind of religious perspective.
Maybe it's just how I perceive them. Yeah.
I mean, my own personal favorite Ark story, we're sharing Ark stories, was that some time ago there was a documentary on TV all about Noah's Ark, and it was very supportive of this notion that it really is there, that a number of expeditions have found it, the Russians are suppressing it, the Smithsonian, National Geographic, the U.S. government is trying to suppress this because we don't want people to know about it. And in this documentary, they interviewed a man who had a large piece of wood that he claimed he had gone to Ararat, he had found the Ark, and he had taken this piece of wood home, and they showed the piece of wood on the TV and said, oh my goodness, this is evidence. We've got good, solid evidence. After the show was aired, the gentleman who had the wood, who actually was a hoaxer, who was trying intentionally to discredit the people making the film, because they never looked into his background, came out with the piece of wood, and he admitted a couple of things. The first thing he admitted, he had never been to Mount Ararat. The next thing he admitted was that the wood had come from a tree in his backyard in California. And the third thing he admitted, that he's decided that the tree, it didn't look old, so in order to make it look old, he soaked it in, are you ready, a vat of teriyaki sauce.
Oh.
So the guy is aging wood by soaking it in a marinade and then handing it to. I know. The people filming this, did they not smell teriyaki sauce
I was
on the piece of wood? And of course, what they didn't do was they made no effort to date the wood, no effort to confirm the guy's story. What they were doing was hearing a claim that they wanted to believe, that they embraced. This is not science, folks. This is something else.
Yeah.
And then presenting it on TV.
I'm sorry, if anybody hands me a piece of wood and tells me that it's part of the Ark, I'm immediately going to not believe them.
Well, especially if this is supposed to be 6,000 years old, we can determine that fairly readily.
Well, it wouldn't be wood anymore. It would have fossilized by now or deteriorated and not. Even if there was an Ark, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that it doesn't physically exist anymore. It was a boat made out of wood.
Well, I mean, it depends. One of the arguments is that there are ice fields up on Ararat, so conceivably it could be encased in ice. 6,000 years is not a really long enough time for complete fossilization.
We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you are and would like to support the podcast, please take a minute to give us a thumbs up or rate the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leaving a brief comment also helps us engage with our audience, and it's good for the algorithm too. If you want to know more about the topics we're discussing, be sure to head over to our Anchor site and look for the show notes for this episode. Links will be in the description. Thank you again, and let's get back to the show.
Back, I think, in the 1950s, soon after the development of radiocarbon dating, somebody was up on the flanks of Ararat, and they brought down some wood, claiming, or at least suggesting, that it could be a piece of the Ark, and it was radiocarbon dated, and it was nowhere near old enough to be the Ark. But then it was investigated, and what they found out was that monks had built a monastery on the flanks of Ararat to commemorate the possibility that the Ark was up there. And now pieces of that monastery used to commemorate the Ark were being used as evidence that the Ark existed in the first place. But to the credit of the researchers, the radiocarbon date showed very clearly that it couldn't be the Ark. It was not old enough to be what the arc was supposed to be.
And that is an excellent segue into C14 dating. And the reliability thereof, because that is another one of these awesome little pamphlets that I have. And this one's written by Mike Riddle, who I don't know who that is, and I haven't looked
Well,
it up
and you know
yet.
what? But it doesn't make any difference.
It's true. Because his argument is that we can't trust, as I understand it, his argument is that we can't trust C14 dating because C14 dating requires that we know the starting amount of C14 in an object, the current amount as it was found, and the half-life of C14, which is not correct. We don't need to know how much starting C14 was in the object, because that's why he says we can't trust it. There's no way for us to know how much C14 was in the object before we dated it, before it went through its half-life. We don't need to know that because we know what the decay rate of carbon is.
The radioactive carbon, we know what the half-life is because we can measure it right here, right now. That's not something that's based on...
And it doesn't change.
That 5,730 years or thereabouts, that's a really good firm count on how long it takes for half of the radioactive carbon, the unstable carbon, the carbon-14, to decay back into nitrogen in any organic sample. The deal is that radiocarbon dating has been very, very tightly controlled for a very long time. And the way in which we can determine the accuracy of it is through tree ring dating. There's a master chronology in the American Southwest, for example, of tree rings. Now, unless you're going to claim that trees for some reason in the past added 5 or 10 or 20 rings in a single year, and there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Tree ring dating is the most accurate, most precise method we have for dating sites. And the master chronology, the master sequence in the Southwest goes back, I think it's more than 11,000 years.
Dendrochronology is one of the first and best ways to date things.
Spectacular. What's really cool about dendro is you understand when a tree adds a ring in a given year, once that ring has been laid down, it is no longer part of the carbon cycle. No new carbon is being laid in there. If you take tree rings from a tree that's 1,000 years old, that innermost ring in a living tree will give you a radiocarbon date of around 1,000 years ago, which is so cool. What that means is we have a way of calibrating radiocarbon dates. The bad news for people who don't like radiocarbon dating is in the calibration, just about anything more than 4,000 years old, radiocarbon years, is actually in calendar years even older. When we get back to, if you have a radiocarbon date of 10,000 years ago, its accurate calendar date is probably around 12,000 years ago. So folks who want radiocarbon dating to be wrong and the world to be much younger than we think it is based on carbon dating, in fact, it's the opposite. It's older than the carbon dates. And fairly recently, there was a wonderful article about using varves. Varves are individual layers laid down in lakes. And there are some beautiful varve sequences where we can actually count back the individual layers. And in one case, that varve sequence goes back 50,000 years, so that you can point to a varve, and by simply counting back from the present varve, you know the exact year that was laid down. Well, what happens is in those layers, the scientists who did the study have recovered organic material, stuff that could be radiocarbon dated. So we now have this enormous sequence that goes back 50,000 years where we not only have the calendar date based on the layers in that lake, but we have the C14 date for that layer. And guess what? Radiocarbon dates are really accurate. They're very, very close, at least proportional to how long ago something happened. So it is absolutely not the case that carbon dating is a bunch of hand waving and there's all these fudge factors. In fact, it's the radiocarbon year is not necessarily an actual calendar year, but based on the calibration curves that are being worked out, especially for the last 12,000 years, and now starting to push that back to 40 or even 50,000 years with these varve sequences, we have a really good handle on this. Now, I will grant you, and you have to understand, carbon dating only works between 40 and 50, anything more than 40,000 years old, 45, you're pushing it at 50,000 years. Anything older than that, there's so little of that carbon-14 left in the sample that because of sampling errors, you're not going to get an accurate date. But the same token, anything less than 300 or 400 years, similarly, not enough of the carbon-14 has decayed away. Your date's not going to be very accurate. It's a statistical procedure.
And those are the ways that people have tried to basically fake out C14 dating that I'm aware of. There's an individual who has taken, that one and sending things that do not contain carbon to be dated.
Right.
Things like rocks. But they will...
Right, of course.
Because there's no rocks. I mean, as far as I understand, rocks don't contain carbon or can't be carbon-14 dated because they don't have, but they're not organic. They're rock.
No, yes. Any of the carbon that's going to be in a rock is carbon-12. Any carbon-14 has long ago decayed away to nitrogen, so you're not going to have carbon-14 in the rock. But what happens then is they'll send off a fossil bone of a dinosaur, and they'll get back a date saying this is greater than 40,000 years, and they'll say, see, this dinosaur is only a little bit more than 40,000 years.
Yes.
A thing, if you gave them a rock that was 4 billion years old, you would come back with a date that was greater than 40,000. Because beyond 40,000, you cannot date anything using radiocarbon dating.
Exactly. They'll send items that are far too recent to be dated, or they'll send objects that are not datable via carbon-14 dating, which is why we have multiple forms, as you were getting at with the dendrochronology and this cool thing with the lakes.
VARVs, yeah.
The VARVs. We use multiple forms of dating techniques to get the dates that we have. We don't just rely on carbon-14 dating. We like that it's as accurate as it is, but we know it's accurate because we can compare it to other dates that we have acquired in different ways.
And another thing that listeners, we have to remind you folks, and it's something that archaeologists admit it's a problem, and that is there's always the possibility for contamination in a date. There's always the possibility of the movement of material from one layer to another. We have to be really careful about that. That is why, and here's the warning, when you see somebody who is providing the date for an archaeological site and they only provide you with one sample, that is a problem. It's a problem because with one sample or maybe two, there's always the possibility of some problem, some screw up. But when somebody has an important archaeological site and they have 10 or 15 or 20 dates, and they all cluster around the same period of time, you can be quite confident that date is correct. I'll give you an example. I excavated a site that, based on the artifacts found at the site, I was guessing that the site was around 3,000 years old. We got multiple samples of charcoal. We sent those out. With one exception, all of the samples came back at about 2,900 years ago, 3,000 years ago, all very nicely, tightly clustered. I got one sample back that said modern, that it was not at all old. When we went back and looked very carefully at the stratigraphy, we found that, in fact, there had been a rodent burrow that had gone through the site that we had not seen previously, and that there was new charcoal on top of the site from a modern kiln, a part of a modern process of producing charcoal. And some of those bits of charcoal had worked its way down the rodent burrow, and that's what we were dating. That's why if we had only provided the lab with that one sample, our date would have been wrong. But we have to be honest. There are times in which either we have not been careful enough or nature has messed with us and there's a contamination. But when we've got multiple dates that all converge on the same period, then we are quite confident that we've got a really good handle on how old the site is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, rodent burrows and tree falls can be blessings.
Drive you crazy. Yeah, exactly.
And they can be screw up your site completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and then that's why if you've ever been to an archaeological excavation, which if there's one going on around you, near you that you're aware of, I highly recommend, as long as it's not a phase 1, because that's just going to be tedious and not worth your time. But if there's a phase 2 or a phase 3 going on, go check it out. Yeah. Most people have public archaeology written into their project plans, and that basically means if people from the public walk up, we will be nice to you, and we will show you things and we will explain things to you.
As we were talking about earlier, Sarah, it was 10 degrees below zero up here in Connecticut. I think it was this morning. So you're not going to find a lot of people doing archaeology this time of year. But yeah,
not even in the South. You're not going to find many people doing digs. But I think they gave up on that last month.
Yeah, I mean, there are instances in which sites that are on private land and the landowner doesn't want a lot of people traipsing across his property. But in many cases, archaeologists are more than happy to let folks come in and see what they're doing, to be able to see what often their tax dollars are paying for. And
exactly.
You see that it is, in fact, a meticulous and careful activity and process.
Yeah.
And, we're not messing around out there. We realize that archaeological sites are precious, non-renewable resources. Every time we excavate a site, there's one fewer site in the world to be excavated. So we do it very, very carefully. And we want to make sure that the results that we come up with, they don't have to conform to some preconceived notion. They're not part of a conspiracy. We're merely trying to expose what we can find out about the past by applying scientific method. That's our goal.
And you'll see people taking, when you go, you'll see people taking different types of samples, but, they'll be filling up bags full of dirt, which make no sense until you realize we're taking it back to float sample it.
Right.
And they will also take samples of charcoal and burned material, and they'll be very, very careful about it. I know there are certain people who they have like a whole separate set of tools just to take carbon samples with.
Right. Oh, yeah.
To take the charcoal samples. Like they won't even use their normal trowel. And, that's one of the reasons they stopped people from smoking on the sites is because the ashes from the cigarettes were getting mixed in with the carbon samples and it was throwing things off really bad.
I'm a stickler. When we're digging in the summer in New England and we've got a lot of bugs and people want to spray themselves with DEET and everything else. And, that's a carbon compound. You don't do that anywhere near where we're digging, and do not touch anything with your bare fingers. Because
as far as I know, no one touches carbon samples with their bare hands.
Right.
Nobody. You always use your trowel tip, or you use some of your excavation tools. I knew a guy who had a special little scoopy tool, and that was what he took his carbon samples with, and he used it for nothing else.
Right.
And he would scoop his stuff out and put it in his tinfoil and send it off. So.
Absolutely. And now, in terms of even older stuff, we do have a bunch of techniques for dating older stuff. There's potassium argon dating and argon dating and uranium series dating, and there's thermoluminescence and paleomagnetism. And in each of these cases, optically stimulated luminescence, we try to apply multiple techniques so that, again, it's this idea of converging evidence. It's like we're not going to rely on one date from one technique if we can possibly help it. We want to be able to say, hey, listen, these various avenues, these various ways of dating a site all point us in the same direction. They're all telling us the same story. And when you've got that, either you have to say somehow magically all of these techniques that are independent and rely on completely different physical processes somehow magically came up with the same date, or you recognize, no, what's going on here is that they're all coming up with the same date, because that's about how old that thing is. So these sites in Africa that are dating to millions of years ago, in which potassium argon or argon dating are being used. Again, those are multiple samples, all coming up with the same date, multiple techniques for the same sources, and people don't publish. For the most part, people don't publish. People don't put their academic lives out there, their academic reputations out there, unless they've got good supporting converging evidence for the date of a site. Nobody wants to go out there with a single date from one technique and have somebody go back in there and use another technique, another sample, and come out with a completely different date. We are aware of those problems, and we do everything we can to address them.
Exactly. Okay, well, I think that pretty much covers everything all of the arguments that could be brought up about Noah's flood.
And I think we've offended probably as many people as we possibly want to.
Oh, I can offend more people, but this is supposed to be a family program.
There you go.
We were told to tone down the swearing, which I don't think we've managed to do this time. So
no, yeah, what happens now is after we hang up, I'm going to release a string of curse words because they're building up inside, and the pressure is building up, and but I'll be fine.
Just got a jar sitting right next to you. You're going to unscrew the lid and just start swearing into it,
and I'll be fine for the next podcast. I'll have emptied myself out. But here's the bottom line here for all this is that scientific creationism is not religion. It is the application of some fake science in an effort to prove the literal truth, often of the Old Testament of the Bible. That's not, for most folks in most religions, that's not really a serious issue.
Yeah, it's not necessary.
But the folks who believe it have enough political clout and get on TV enough, and they yell loud enough so that obviously we need to respond to that to make sure that kids are taught science in schools. It just makes sense that one of my favorite quotes is from a theologian from the 17th century who was an interesting character, John Ray, who said, look, a lot of folks decry science and they say we shouldn't be doing science. But what John Ray said, and this guy was a very religious man, he was a minister in the Anglican Church, he said, God, this is him speaking, I believe God gave us these brains. And if he gave us these brains, it was for a purpose, and that is to study the world and come to our own conclusions. And that's exactly what we're doing. Anybody who thinks differently, then we have a real issue about what we should be doing in terms of a scientific approach to studying humanity, the universe, the planet.
And that's why you will find many scientists in all fields, including evolution, who are religious in some way, but they are able to maintain their religion and their science separately, that's what needs to happen. Your personal beliefs are nobody's business but your own. But when you start trying to make your personal beliefs, start trying to make your science match your personal beliefs, then you need to take the step back because you're not doing science anymore.
And then when you do that, then again, like I said before, you're in our ballpark. This is our place.
Yeah, and you got to bring the evidence.
Not in my house, is what we say in sports, right? Well, but then you have to be prepared to accept, as all scientists are, the questioning, the skepticism, and the criticism. Exactly. Yep. That's nothing different from what you or I would get from our colleagues if we came up with a hypothesis that they said that they maybe were not certain of. It's no different.
Yeah, no. We defend things all the time, on and off the field.
Well, this was great fun, Sarah.
It was, Ken, and thank you very much. We'll be doing this again in 2 weeks, and we'll be talking to, hopefully, Andrew White then.
Fantastic.
All right, well, I'll talk to you later, man.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All these things we make no apology for the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosoup Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archyfantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcast.network.com/archyfantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archyfantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archyfantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archyfantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. 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 Rate your trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.